Mr. Vance, as someone who so passionately defends American values, how do you respond to accusations that your wife, Usha, is still foreign at heart and influencing your administration's policy on India? The studio fell into dead silence. Someone in the audience gasped. The camera zoomed in on the vice president's face. He didn't move. For a brief moment, complete stillness. Then slowly, locking eyes with Monica, he said, "Before I answer, Monica, are you sure you want to go down that road?" The silence thickened. It felt like the air in the studio had turned solid. The journalist didn't flinch. "I'm just asking what many Americans want to know," she replied with a cold smile. "Or is there something you're afraid to say?" Vance straightened up. His voice was calm, but steel edged every word. "The most incredible part is still ahead. Stay tuned to find out how it all ends. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss it." Monica Castillo adjusted a perfectly coiffed strand of hair and checked her reflection in the dressing room mirror. 20 years in journalism had taught her one thing: looks matter, especially when you're about to destroy the vice president's career on live television. "Monica, he'll be here in 5 minutes," the assistant said, poking his head in the door. "The producer asked me to remind you, gently first, then under the belt." Castillo smiled, revealing snow-white teeth. "Don't worry, Mike. I know how to take down guys like Vance. By the end of the show, his image as the voice of working America will be gone." There was controlled excitement in the NBS studio. Technicians were checking lights, sound engineers were adjusting microphones, and executive producer Alex Friedman had already settled in next to Monica's chair. "The ratings are going to be crazy," he whispered as Castillo took her seat. "Everyone wants to see you catch him out on the Ukraine question." "This is just a warm-up," Monica winked. "The real bomb is the question about his wife. Our research team has unearthed some interesting connections between Usha's family and certain business interests in India. Vance doesn't know that we know this." Friedman chuckled contentedly. "You're the best at what you do, Monica. After the question about Ukraine, we'll start a montage of critical commentary on the administration's foreign policy. Viewers should see the contrast between their words and reality." In the corner of the studio, a group of analysts were reviewing the vice president's latest tweets and preparing a real-time fact check. One of them, a young woman with a laptop, looked up. "Monica, we found contradictions in his latest statements about financing Ukraine. He said different things to different audiences." "Excellent," Castillo nodded. "Give the data to the director. Have him prepare the graphics. I want this to pop up on screen the moment he starts to wriggle out of it." The makeup artist approached Monica with a powder puff, applying the finishing touches. "I hear he's quite charming," she remarked. "Don't let his farmer charm fool you." "Honey," Monica rolled her eyes, "I've interviewed dictators and war criminals. This upstart from Ohio poses no threat to me." At that moment, the studio door opened and J.D. Vance walked in, accompanied by just 2 aides. Monica sat up straight. She had expected to see a tense, wary man surrounded by an army of advisors. Instead, the vice president looked relaxed, almost serene. "Miss Castillo," Vance extended his hand, "we finally meet. I've heard about your special interview style." His handshake was firm, his gaze direct. Monica felt a twinge of irritation. Where was the nervousness? Where was the evidence that he felt cornered? "Mr. Vice President," she said with a polished, professional smile, "we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule, especially given a challenging week for the administration." A subtle jab, a reference to the recent series of critical publications on foreign policy. "I always have time in my schedule to talk to the American people," Vance said, settling into the chair opposite, "even if the intermediary isn't always friendly." A quiet laugh ran through the room. He had won the first round. Monica made a mental note. He came prepared. 3 minutes until airtime, the director announced. The makeup artist powdered the contestants' faces one last time. Monica looked through the question cards, even though she knew them by heart. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed that Vance wasn't looking at any notes. He was just sitting there staring straight ahead, as if collecting his thoughts. 30 seconds. Castillo glanced at the producer, who gave her a thumbs up. Everything was going according to plan. 10 seconds. 5, 3, 2, 1. We're on the air. Good evening, America. This is Monica Castillo in Straight Talk. Our guest today is Vice President of the United States, James David Vance. Mr. Vice President, welcome. Thank you, Monica. Glad to be here. The camera showed a close-up of his face, open, confident, with a barely noticeable half-smile. Not the face of a man preparing for interrogation. Mr. Vance, let's start with a simple question. You've gone from a Marine from a working-class family to a successful entrepreneur, writer, and now the second-ranking person in the country. How would you explain your success? Is it just luck, or... Vance tilted his head slightly as if thinking. You know, Monica, it's interesting that you start with the word luck. In certain circles, that word is used to denigrate the achievements of people who don't fit into the elite narrative. He paused. Luck doesn't write books. Luck doesn't get companies off the ground. And luck certainly doesn't get a Marine from Ohio into the White House. Monica felt her facial muscles tense, but she kept her smile. So you're saying that you achieved everything solely through your own efforts? I say success comes to those who deserve it, Vance said, leaning forward a little. Yes, I was lucky to be born in America, where the opportunity to rise from the bottom still exists, despite what some people say. But there were sleepless nights, deals that seemed impossible, challenges that would have broken many others. He paused. And most importantly, I never did it alone. Monica raised an eyebrow slightly. She had decided not to broach the subject of family yet. It was a trump card for later in the interview. It's interesting what you say about rising from the bottom, she continued, moving on to the next topic. In your book, you wrote about the destruction of the American dream for the working class. But having become part of the Washington elite, do you feel like you've become disconnected from the problems of ordinary people? Vance smiled, but his eyes remained serious. Washington elite? He shook his head. Monica, when was the last time you were in Middletown, Ohio? Or Jackson, Kentucky? You know, every weekend I go home. Not to some mansion in the country, but to the same neighborhood where I grew up. My grandmother still lives in the same house. And when I sit on the porch with her, believe me, I remember very well who I am and where I came from. The answer sounded sincere, and Monica noticed some of the studio audience nodding in approval. This was not part of her plan. And yet, she insisted, critics point out certain contradictions between your words and your actions. For example, you talked about the importance of protecting American jobs, but supported trade agreements that experts say encourage outsourcing. Do you always believe the experts? Vance made air quotes. The same experts who have been telling Midwestern workers for decades that the loss of their factories was simply inevitable globalization? I believe the facts, Monica. And the facts are this. We've brought back more manufacturing jobs in the last year than in the previous 5. Those aren't contradictions, they're results. Monica noticed that she was beginning to lose control of the interview. Vance was answering too confidently, too specifically. It was time to speed up the transition to more complex topics. Let's talk about foreign policy, she said, shuffling cards. Many Americans are wondering, why does the administration continue to funnel billions of dollars to Ukraine when our own cities are facing a homelessness crisis, crumbling infrastructure, and rising prices? The director confirmed in the earpiece. The graphics with Vance's contradictory statements were ready to be shown on cue. Vance paused for a moment, as if collecting his thoughts. Monica smiled to herself. She had finally found a weak spot. The Ukraine issue was a difficult one for the administration. Polls showed support for the policy, falling among ordinary Americans. That's a profound question, Monica, Vance began, his tone becoming more thoughtful. And it deserves a serious answer, not just slogans. We have plenty of time, she assured with feigned goodwill. Okay, Vance nodded. Then let's start with the facts. Americans deserve the truth, not the manipulation of numbers. First, the total amount of aid to Ukraine is less than 2% of the federal budget. For comparison, we spend 50 times more on medical care for our citizens and 30 times more on our own defense. Monica noticed some raised eyebrows in the audience. That statistic wasn't in her prep materials. But, let me finish, Vance said firmly, raising his hand. Second, every dollar of military aid to Ukraine is spent 85% here in America. That money goes to factories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, creating those very jobs we just talked about. And third, and most important, this is not a zero-sum game. What do you mean? Monica asked, confused that the conversation was not going according to her script. I mean, it's a false dichotomy, helping Ukraine, or solving problems at home. Real leaders can do both. And you know what? That's exactly what we're doing. Last week, the president signed the biggest infrastructure bill in a decade. $2 trillion for our roads, bridges, broadband. Where were the headlines about that? Monica felt a chill run down her spine. Vance had completely taken over the conversation. Mr. Vice President, she tried to get back to her plan, but isn't it contradictory for you to talk about America first and at the same time support this huge overseas spending? Vance looked straight into the camera. Let me put this question directly to the American people. America first does not mean America alone. It means defending American interests and values. And let me ask everyone watching, Do you believe that allowing an aggressor to invade its neighbors with impunity is in the American interest? Do you believe that a world where force supersedes law will be safer or cheaper for us in the long run? Monica noticed people in the studio nodding. She had to get back in control quickly. Many experts will disagree with your assessment. Which experts, Monica? Vance interrupted. The same ones who predicted the war would be over in 3 days? Or the ones who insisted sanctions would never work? I prefer to listen to our military, our intelligence community, and, most importantly, the American people, who understand the difference between spending and investing. Friedman gestured furiously behind the camera, pointing to the graphics they had prepared. But Monica knew that would only make things worse now. Vance controlled the narrative too well. What about the concern that this conflict could escalate into something more, she asked, moving on to another aspect. It's a serious matter, Vance said, and that's why we're being so careful and thoughtful. But you know what? Behind the scenes, when the cameras are off, leaders of both parties support our policies. They see the intelligence. They understand the stakes. This isn't a partisan issue. It's a national security issue. Then Vance made an unexpected move. Can I tell you a story, Monica? I recently met with Sergeant Michael Rodriguez from Tampa, Florida. He had just returned from a mission training Ukrainian soldiers. You know what he said to me? He said, Mr. Vice President, these guys are fighting for the same values that I took an oath to protect, and they're doing it with weapons that are older than they are. The least we can do is give them a chance. Monica saw a woman in the front row of the audience brush away a tear. This was getting out of hand. Vance was turning a complex geopolitical topic into an emotional story about values and duty, themes that resonated with Americans far more powerfully than abstract budget debates. But unlimited support. Who said anything about unlimited support? Vance interrupted again. We set clear conditions. We demand transparency. We insist on reforms. And most importantly, we invest in the end result, which must be a fair and lasting peace. Not because it is easy, but because it is the right thing to do. And not only for Ukraine, but also for our children, who deserve a peace where borders are respected and aggression has a price. The studio audience began to applaud. This was unprecedented. Political talk show audiences usually remain neutral until the end of the program. Monica saw Friedman pointing to his watch in panic. It was time to move on to a commercial break, but she knew she couldn't go on a break now, leaving the topic in such a disadvantageous position for her. Mr. Vice President, with respect, but many Americans still believe that these billions could be better served here at home, solving our own crises. Monica, Vance leaned forward, his voice quieter but more intense. I grew up in a town where factories closed, where my neighbors lost their homes and their hope. I know firsthand what an American crisis is, and I also know that America is big enough, strong enough, and rich enough to solve its problems and defend its values in the world. Anyone who tells you we have to choose is either underestimating America or underestimating you. The audience applauded again, louder this time. Monica felt sweat break out on her forehead. This was a disaster. Vance wasn't just parrying her questions. He was using them as a springboard for his own points. Her carefully laid trap was turning into his triumph. Friedman desperately pointed to his watch. It was time to save the situation. We'll return to this conversation after a short break, she announced. Stay tuned. There are still many tough questions for Vice President Vance ahead. As soon as the cameras turned off, Friedman ran up to her. What's going on? You're letting him control the entire conversation. He's better prepared than we expected, Monica hissed. But don't worry. After the break, I'll get straight to the personal stuff. He won't have a chance to turn the story about his wife into a patriotic speech. She glanced at Vance, who was calmly drinking water and scrolling through his phone. No nervousness, no discomfort. He looked like a man in complete control of the situation. 50 seconds until airtime, the director announced. Monica took a deep breath. She was known for her ability to corner guests. Today would be no exception. After the break, she would bring out the big guns. The question about Vance's wife, carefully crafted by her team, would be the hook that would bring the real Vance to the surface. She had almost been waiting for this moment. 10 seconds. 5, 3, 2, 1. And we're back on the air, Monica announced as the camera's red light flashed. Continuing our candid conversation with Vice President J.D. Vance. Vance seemed unfazed by the interview's rough start. Monica noticed that during the commercial break, Friedman's team had prepared new graphics on the screens behind her. A map of Ukraine with U.S. aid amounts and a timeline of the conflict marked. Mr. Vice President, before the break we started talking about foreign policy, Monica continued. Let's dive into the Ukraine issue. In a recent poll, 63% of Americans said they thought aid to Ukraine was excessive given our own economic crisis. How do you explain to people why the administration continues to send billions of dollars overseas while our own cities are falling apart? The camera zoomed in on Vance's face. He didn't look angry or defensive, but rather thoughtful. You know, Monica, behind every number in the survey are real people with real concerns, he began. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio, where factories were closing and infrastructure was crumbling. I understand why many Americans are asking this question. He paused and Monica opened her mouth to intervene. But Vance continued. But let's look beyond the headlines. First, the amount of aid to Ukraine is less than 2% of the federal budget. By comparison, we spend 50 times that on domestic healthcare. Second, about 85% of military aid to Ukraine is money that is spent here in America, in our factories, creating American jobs. But these are still billions that could be used directly to solve domestic problems, insisted Monica. Let me ask you a counter question, Vance leaned forward. What is more valuable, preventing a war or fighting one ourselves? History has shown that prevention is always cheaper. Do you really think that without our intervention, the conflict will spill over into NATO territory? Monica's voice sounded skeptical. I'm not a fortune teller, Vance said, but I know history. Aggression that's allowed to go unpunished rarely stops at its first victim, and the cost of intervention increases exponentially with every missed chance to stop it early. Monica decided to change tactics. Recently, documents have leaked online that show large-scale corruption in Ukraine. Some of the weapons we supply simply disappear or are sold on the black market. How can you guarantee American taxpayers that their money's not going down the drain? Headlines about corruption scandals in Ukraine appeared on the big screen. That's why Vance didn't even glance at the graphics behind the presenter. We have an unprecedented system of control and accountability. We have a special inspector general who tracks every dollar, every piece of equipment. We use satellite surveillance, on-site inspections, digital tagging. This is the most transparent military aid program in history. But leaks still happen, insisted Monica. In any complex operation, there may be problems, Vance agreed. But you know what? When we find a problem, we solve it. We insist on reforms, we demand responsibility, and these demands have already brought results. Ukraine is carrying out the most extensive anti-corruption reforms in its history. It sounds convincing in words, Monica smiled skeptically, but many experts doubt the effectiveness of these measures. Vance thought for a moment, then suddenly said, Let me tell you a story that didn't make the headlines. Last week, I spoke with Sergeant Michael Rodriguez of the 82nd Airborne Division. He had just returned from a mission training Ukrainian troops. You know what he told me? Enlighten us. Monica's voice was tinged with sarcasm. He said, Mr. Vice President, I was a skeptic. I didn't understand why we were wasting resources on this war. But when I saw these kids, teachers, engineers, ordinary citizens taking up arms to protect their families, I realized something important. They're fighting for the same values I took an oath to defend, and they're doing it with weapons older than they are. The least we can do is give them a chance. Silence fell over the studio. Even Monica momentarily lost her assertiveness. It's a touching story, she finally said, but isolated stories don't change the strategic picture. The fact remains, we're wasting resources on someone else's war instead of using them to solve our own problems. Vance shook his head. It's a false dichotomy, Monica. Great nations can do both. We can rebuild our infrastructure and defend our values in the world. We can lower the cost of medicine and resist aggression. It's not an either-or question. It's a question of priorities and leadership. But the reality is, Monica leaned forward, that every dollar spent on Ukraine is a dollar that is not spent on solving American problems. That's a simplification that ignores the real economy, Vance countered. When we fund arms production, we create jobs in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, the very states that have suffered the most from deindustrialization. When we strengthen Europe, we protect our trade relationships, which bring trillions of dollars into the American economy. Foreign and domestic policy are intertwined. Monica noticed that some in the audience began to nod in agreement. This was a bad sign. Let's look at a specific example. She decided to approach it from a different angle. The administration recently announced an additional $10 billion in aid to Ukraine. At the same time, the school lunch program for low-income children received only $3 billion. How do you explain these priorities to a mother whose child does not receive adequate nutrition at school? The camera zoomed in on Vance's face, his expression becoming more serious. I'll tell her the truth, Monica, that it pains me to see American children starving, that I know firsthand what it's like to depend on school lunches to feed myself, that we're working to increase funding for this and other vital programs. He paused and then continued. But I will also tell her that a world in which dictators can attack their neighbors with impunity is a world in which her child will live with greater danger and fewer opportunities. that sometimes we have to make difficult choices today to ensure a better tomorrow. But that tomorrow may not come for the children who are hungry today. Monica tried to play on the emotions. That's why, Vance's voice grew more passionate. Last month, we launched the largest school nutrition overhaul in a decade. It didn't make headlines because good news rarely makes headlines, but it's changing the lives of real kids right now. We can do both, Monica, and we are. Monica noticed the producer behind the camera signaling her to move on to a more pressing issue. She decided to take the advice. Mr. Vice President, information recently leaked that you had a serious confrontation with the National Security Advisor over Ukraine's strategy. Sources say you advocated cutting aid, but publicly supported the administration's official line. Is that true? A tense silence fell over the studio. Vance sat up straight in his chair, his face unreadable. You know what always amazes me about Washington, Monica? He said finally. How easily anonymous sources can turn normal discussions into dramatic confrontations. Yes, we had discussions about strategy. That's how competent government should work. We looked at different scenarios, analyzed risks, assessed results, and at the end of that process, we came to a decision that I fully support. So you deny that you were against the current level of aid? Monica insisted. I reject your characterization of the process, Vance said firmly. Unlike previous administrations, we are not afraid of different opinions and healthy debate. But once a decision is made, we act as a team. Monica felt herself losing control of the conversation. Vance was skillfully turning every potentially contentious moment into a display of competent management. Let's get back to the question of priorities, she tried to regroup. Last week, we saw terrible flooding in Mississippi. Thousands of Americans were left homeless. Many of them are still waiting for federal aid. How can we justify sending billions overseas when our own citizens are suffering? First, Vance replied, let me be clear. We released $500 million in emergency flood relief in the first 48 hours. I personally visited the flooded areas 3 days ago. FEMA is launching its largest rescue operation in 5 years. He paused and then continued. But there is a deeper question here. Why are we forced to choose? Why, in the richest country in the world, are we debating whether to help our citizens or to protect our interests abroad? The answer is simple. Decades of misplaced priorities and short-sighted policies. And it is this legacy that we are now grappling with. So you're shifting responsibility to previous administrations? Monica tried to catch him in a political maneuver. I'm stating the facts, Vance replied calmly. You can't fix in a year what's been falling apart for decades, but we're working on it. The infrastructure bill we passed was the largest in 50 years. The American Manufacturing Revival Program created more than 1 million new jobs. We lowered the cost of insulin for millions of Americans. He leaned forward. And you know what? We do all this while defending the global order that has sustained American prosperity for decades. Because real leadership isn't about finding easy answers or false choices. It's about solving complex problems holistically. Monica noticed that many in the audience were nodding in agreement. Time was running out, and she still hadn't cornered Vance on the Ukrainian issue. She had to make one last attempt. Mr. Vice President, let's talk about specific risks. Many military experts warn that continuing to supply weapons to Ukraine could escalate the conflict to the level of direct confrontation with Russia. Are you willing to risk American lives for the sake of Ukraine's borders? There was silence in the studio. Vance paused for a long moment before answering. When he did, his voice was quiet, but every word was clear. Monica, my son is in the Marines. My brother is an Afghanistan veteran. Believe me, I think about the risks of escalation every day, every hour. And that's why we act so carefully, so calculatedly. He paused and there was complete silence in the studio. Our strategy is simple. Help Ukraine defend itself so that America does not have to intervene directly. This is not only morally right, it is pragmatic and in our national interest. And every decision we make is carefully assessed for escalation risks. But you can't guarantee that American soldiers won't be drawn into this conflict, Monica insisted. In an uncertain world, there are no absolute guarantees, Vance replied. Anyone who offers such guarantees is either naive or dishonest. But I can say this. Our policy is precisely to prevent a scenario in which American forces are forced to intervene. Every decision we make is aimed at de-escalation, not escalation. He looked straight into the camera. And I want to speak directly to every military family watching right now. I understand your concerns. I share them. And I pledge to you, we will not recklessly risk the lives of your loved ones. Monica saw a woman in the front row of the audience, wiping away a tear. It was a disastrous failure. Instead of making Vance look like an unfeeling hawk, she had unwittingly given him a platform to demonstrate deep understanding and genuine concern. She decided to make one last lunge. In conclusion to our conversation about Ukraine, Mr. Vice President, many believe that this war is already lost, and we are simply delaying the inevitable while spending billions. What do you say to these critics? Vance sat up straight in his chair. I will tell them that they underestimate the courage of the Ukrainian people and the resolve of America and our allies. History is full of examples of cynics prematurely declaring defeat, from the American Revolution to the Cold War. And every time, they were wrong. His voice became stronger. But I also want to say something more important. This situation is not just a geopolitical conflict. It is a defining moment for our generation. Do we stand by the principles we proclaim? Are we prepared to defend a world based on rules, not on the rule of force? Or will we retreat, signaling to all future aggressors that violence pays? He paused and there was complete silence in the studio. I choose to stand for our principles, not because it is easy, but because it is right. Not because victory is guaranteed, but because the alternative, a world where aggression has no price, is far more dangerous and ultimately more costly to every American. The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, something that almost never happened in the middle of an interview like this. Monica realized that she had completely lost this part of the conversation. Vance wasn't just answering her questions. He was using each one to present a coherent, principled vision of American foreign policy that, to her horror, clearly resonated with the audience. Thank you for your answers, Mr. Vice President, she said finally. We'll be back after a short break with more direct questions. As soon as the cameras turned off, Friedman jumped up to her. This is a disaster. He turns every question you ask into an opportunity for his sermon. Calm down. Monica wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. He won't be able to get out of the next topic as gracefully. Get the materials on his wife ready. We'll hit him right after the break. She glanced briefly at Vance, who was calmly sipping water and looking over some notes. No nervousness, no sign of stress. It only made her more determined to corner him with another round of questions. 40 seconds until airtime, the director announced. Monica adjusted the microphone and prepared for the final attack. The question about Vance's wife was her trump card, carefully designed to catch him off guard. She almost smiled, imagining his confidence melting away when she brought it up. 10 seconds. 5, 3, 2, 1. And we're back live. Monica Castillo smiled as the camera's red light flashed, continuing our candid conversation with Vice President J.D. Vance. Backstage, Friedman gave her a thumbs up. The live ratings flashed on the monitors in front of him. They were breaking all season records. The audience was glued to the screens, and now was the moment to deliver the decisive blow. Mr. Vice President, Monica leaned forward slightly. Let's talk about something more personal. Vance smiled with a hint of wariness. Of course, Monica. Although I admit I prefer to discuss politics rather than my personal life. But isn't the personal political, especially for people of your stature? The journalist retorted. After all, you are one of the most influential people in the country. To some extent, that's true, Vance nodded. Although I believe that everyone deserves a certain personal boundary, even when holding a public office. Monica pretended to accept his point, but her next question was already prepared. She paused, building tension, then spoke slowly and clearly. Mr. Vance, as someone who so fiercely defends American values, how do you respond to accusations that your own wife, Usha, is still a foreigner at heart and influences your policy toward India? There was a dead silence in the studio. Someone in the audience gasped loudly. The cameraman inadvertently zoomed in on Vance's face so that the audience could clearly see his reaction. The vice president froze. For a split second, his face was impassive, frozen like a mask. Then he sat up slowly in his chair. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. Before I answer your question, Monica, I want to clarify. Is that really what you want to ask? Do you realize what you just assumed? Monica hadn't expected that counter question. She'd expected a tantrum or a defensive stance. But Vance remained composed, though the tension radiating from him was almost palpable. I'm simply voicing a question that many Americans are asking, she replied with a professional smile. After all, your wife was born in India, became an American citizen only 12 years ago, and there are reports of her family ties to certain business interests in Mumbai that could benefit from new trade agreements signed under your administration. The screen behind the presenter showed photographs of Usha Vance at various events related to Indo-U.S. cooperation, as well as charts of trade turnover between the countries, with a marked increase over the past year. Vance stared at the images with an unreadable expression. Then he took a deep breath and turned to the camera. I want to speak directly to the American people. What you just heard is not just an inappropriate question. It is the embodiment of xenophobia and prejudice disguised as investigative journalism. Mr. Vice President, that's a serious accusation, Monica interrupted. I'm just asking questions that... No, Vance snapped, and the audience probably saw him interrupt for the first time. You're not just asking questions. You're spreading innuendo that questions the loyalty of an American citizen based solely on his birthplace. What else is that but xenophobia? Monica was a little confused, but quickly pulled herself together. Mr. Vice President, the issue is not your wife's place of birth, but a potential conflict of interest. Let's get the facts straight, Vance said, sitting up straighter in his chair, his voice sharper. My wife, Dr. Usha Vance, was born in India. That's true. She came to this country at the age of 19, was educated at our finest universities, spent 20 years serving American patients as a heart surgeon, saved hundreds of lives, and yes, 12 years ago, went through the same naturalization process as millions of other immigrants who call America home. He paused to let his words carry more weight. And you know what? I'm proud of that. I'm proud that my wife embodies that American dream that we talk about so often. The idea that a person can come here from anywhere in the world, work hard, and succeed based on their merits, not their background. Some of the studio audience began to applaud, but Monica raised her hand, calling for silence. But the question remains open, Mr. Vice President. Does your wife's background influence the administration's policy toward India? You know what drives our India policy? Vance replied. Geopolitical realities, economic facts, the strategic interests of the United States. That India is the world's largest democracy and a natural counterweight to China's influence in the region. That economic engagement with India creates jobs here in America. He looked straight into the camera. But you know what really bothers me about your question? The implication that first-generation Americans, immigrants, are somehow less loyal, less American than others. That's not just offensive. It goes against the grain of what it means to be American. Mr. Vice President, no one disputes the patriotism of immigrants in general. Monica tried to object. We are talking specifically about... I think that's exactly what we're talking about, Vance interrupted. Because if my wife had been born in Iowa or Texas, this question wouldn't have arisen, would it? If her name had been Sarah or Jane instead of Usha, we wouldn't be discussing her loyalty right now. Silence fell over the studio. Monica felt that she was losing control of the situation, but decided to continue the attack. Let's get specific. Last month, your administration signed a trade deal with India that removed tariffs on imported pharmaceutical components. Bharat Pharma, a company run by your wife's cousin, won a major contract from American manufacturers shortly thereafter. Is that just a coincidence? A diagram appeared on the screen behind the presenter, with photographs of Usha's relatives and arrows showing the supposed connections. Vance looked at the diagram, and a shadow of a smile flickered across his face. Not a cheerful one, but rather one of surprise at such obvious manipulation. Monica, I don't know who drew up this colorful diagram for you, but there are some serious problems with it. First, the man you called my wife's cousin is not actually related to her. He is a former colleague of her father's, whom she dated twice in her life. He paused, watching the journalist's face change. Second, the agreement you're talking about was drafted over 3 years by a team of experts at the Commerce Department and has bipartisan support in Congress. Third, the primary beneficiaries of this agreement are American pharmaceutical companies, who can now lower the cost of drugs for American patients. And finally, fourth, his voice hardened, my wife has never, not once, participated in any discussion related to this agreement. Monica felt the ground slipping from under her feet, but decided to make another lunge. However, your wife regularly meets Indian businessmen and politicians during official and unofficial events? As she has with representatives of dozens of other countries, Vance countered. She is the Second Lady of the United States, Monica. It is part of her role to engage in diplomatic functions, cultural exchanges, charitable initiatives, just as every Second Lady before her has done. He leaned forward. But let's call a spade a spade. If my wife were from Britain or France, her diplomatic meetings with representatives of those countries wouldn't arouse your suspicions, would they? If her skin were lighter and her accent less noticeable, would we be having this conversation now? There was complete silence in the studio. Monica felt the audience shifting to Vance's side. This could not be allowed. Mr. Vice President, I'm just asking questions that concern the American people. She tried to defend herself. Transparency and the absence of conflicts of interest are the cornerstones of democracy. You're absolutely right, Vance suddenly agreed. Transparency is critical. That's why my wife and I have undergone the most thorough background checks on our finances, our relationships, and our potential conflicts of interest? All of these documents are publicly available. We disclose every single asset and liability down to the last cent every year. He paused. But you know what isn't transparent. Hints and innuendos without concrete evidence. Manipulative schemes with arrows that create the illusion of connections that don't exist. That's not journalism, Monica. That's propaganda. Monica realized that she was losing control of the situation. It was necessary to change tactics immediately. Mr. Vice President, many Americans are also concerned about the cultural aspect. Your wife regularly wears traditional Indian clothing at official events and often talks about her Indian heritage. Some are concerned that she has not fully assimilated into American culture. There were outraged cries from the audience. One of the spectators even stood up, but security asked him to sit down. Vance closed his eyes for a moment, as if collecting his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but each word seemed to ring in the air. You know, Monica, my maternal grandfather was an Irish immigrant. He came to this country with $10 in his pocket and spoke with a noticeable accent for the rest of his life. Every year on March 17th, he wore a green tie and sang Irish songs. Did that make him less American? Of course not. Vance paused, his eyes sparkling. America's greatness doesn't come from asking people to abandon their heritage. America's greatness comes from embracing that heritage as part of the rich cultural fabric of our nation. Millions of Americans celebrate Cinco de Mayo, Lunar New Year, Oktoberfest, and that makes America stronger, not weaker. He raised his voice, and now there was undisguised passion in it. My wife is as proud of her Indian heritage as she is of being an American. And you know what? I am proud of her heritage too. I am proud that my children are growing up understanding the richness of both cultures. I am proud that we celebrate Thanksgiving and Diwali in our home, because that is what America is really like. Not a melting pot where all the differences disappear, but a magnificent mosaic where every culture, every tradition adds its own colors. The audience burst into spontaneous applause. Monica realized that the situation was completely out of control, but she couldn't stop now. And yet, Mr. Vice President, your wife rarely speaks publicly, rarely gives interviews. Some consider this strange for a person of her position. Strange? Vance asked, slightly surprised. Or just not what you expected? Usha is a doctor, a scientist, not a politician. She doesn't seek publicity or attention. She prefers to do her job quietly and efficiently. That's a quality I deeply respect. He bowed his head slightly. But it's interesting that you bring this up. When First Lady Michelle Obama decided to focus on healthy eating and physical activity for children, no one called it weird. When Laura Bush chose literacy as her main initiative, no one asked her to speak out more. Why should Usha, who dedicates her time to fighting heart disease and expanding access to healthcare, be held to a different standard? Monica felt that every question she asked was turning against her, but she still had one more trump card. However, there are reports that your wife has significant influence on your policy, not only on India, but on other issues as well. Sources inside the White House say that she often expresses strong opinions that are then reflected in official decisions. Vance smiled, and this time there was something almost predatory in his smile. These mysterious sources inside the White House, could they be more specific? Name names, dates, decisions that my wife allegedly influenced? Monica remained silent, and Vance continued. Of course not, because it's fiction. But even if it were true, what's so strange about it? Do you really think that presidents and vice presidents throughout history have not discussed affairs of state with their spouses? That George Washington didn't ask Martha's opinion? That Ronald Reagan didn't consult Nancy? He leaned forward, his voice becoming quieter but more intense. My wife is a brilliant person with a PhD and 20 years of experience making life or death decisions in the operating room. Darn right I ask her opinion. I'd be a fool not to. But I make decisions based on data, expert advice, and my own judgment. Monica realized that each of her attacks only strengthened Vance's position. It was necessary to urgently change tactics. Let's talk about another aspect. Your wife comes from a privileged upper-caste Indian family. How does that fit with your image as the voice of working America? Vance froze for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was cold. Do you know my wife's story, Monica? Do you really know it, and not from some sources? Her father was a school teacher in a small town in Karnataka. Her mother was a nurse. They lived in a 2-room apartment and saved every rupee to give their children an education. He paused. Usha got a scholarship to study at a medical college. She worked extra shifts to send money home. Then she won a grant to study in America and came here with 2 suitcases and a dream. Privileged. I think we understand this word differently. He leaned forward. But even if she was from a wealthy family, what difference does it make? Don't we believe in America that a man is judged by his own merits and character, not by his birth? Monica felt that her last attempt to corner Vance had also failed. She made one last desperate throw. A final question, Mr. Vice President. Many find it odd that a man of your background, a working-class Ohioan, a Marine, a symbol of real America, would marry a woman from a completely different culture, with different values. Some even suggest that it was a calculated political move to create a more inclusive image. There was a dead silence in the studio. Someone in the audience swore loudly. The producer behind the camera turned pale. Monica had gone too far, even by his standards. Vance didn't answer right away. He looked at Monica as if he were seeing her for the first time. Not with anger, but with a kind of cold, assessing interest. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost calm. You know, Monica, I met Usha at the Veterans Hospital in Cincinnati. It was 5 years before I decided to go into politics. She was a heart surgeon who saved my uncle's life after a severe heart attack. I came to thank her and invited her for coffee. At first, she turned me down, then she agreed to have one dinner, and then I realized that I had met the person I wanted to spend my life with. He paused, not because she was exotic or different, but because she was and remains the smartest, strongest, most caring woman I have ever met. Because her values, hard work, integrity, service to others, aligned with my own. Because despite the different paths that led us to that hospital in Cincinnati, we shared the same vision of what the world should be. His voice became stronger. You know what's most ironic about your suggestion? That you're implicitly suggesting that people from different cultures can't genuinely love each other or share common values. That a real American can only marry someone who looks and sounds exactly like him. That's not just offensive. It goes against everything that makes America special. Vance turned to the camera, as if speaking directly to the audience, and to the millions of American families watching this interview right now. Families where the husband and wife come from different backgrounds, different cultures, different skin colors. I want to say, your love is real. Your family is real, and anyone who suggests otherwise misses the point of being an American. The audience burst into applause. Several people stood up from their seats. Monica saw a woman in the front row openly crying. Friedman, off camera, was signaling desperately that it was time to end the segment. But Vance wasn't done yet. He turned back to Monica, his voice now steely. You know what really bothers me about this conversation, Monica? It's that your questions represent more than just one journalist's personal opinion. They reflect a broader trend in our media landscape, a trend that encourages division, fear, and suspicion. He leaned forward. When you imply that my wife is somehow less American because of her birthplace, you are telling millions of naturalized citizens that they will never be truly accepted. When you suggest that preserving cultural traditions means divided loyalties, you are telling entire ethnic communities that they must give up their identities to be real Americans. His voice became louder. It's not just offensive, Monica. It's dangerous. It undermines the very idea of who we are as a nation. America didn't become great by demanding uniformity. America became great by celebrating diversity, united by shared values and a shared desire for freedom. Vance sat up straight in his chair, his face serious. And you know what? I will not allow you or anyone else to undermine that vision. Not because I'm the vice president, but because I'm an American who believes in a better, more unifying version of our country than the one you're trying to push. The audience burst into thunderous applause. Many of the spectators stood up. Monica felt her cheeks burn. In the earpiece, Friedman's voice almost screamed, "Commercial break! Urgent!" "We'll be back after a short break," she said, barely hiding the tremor in her voice. As soon as the cameras turned off, the studio was filled with a buzz of excited conversation. Several members of the audience gave a standing ovation. Friedman ran up to Monica. "What the heck is going on? He turns every question you ask into a triumph. We need to change our strategy immediately." "But you yourself insisted on the question about his wife," Monica snapped. "You considered it our main trump card." "Yes, but not like that." Friedman frantically looked through the notes. "We are losing the audience. The ratings show that 78% of viewers are on his side. This is a disaster." Monica glanced at Vance, who was calmly drinking water and scrolling through his phone. How did he stay so collected? She felt her control of the situation slipping away completely. "Do we have anything else?" she asked Friedman. "Any information that could destabilize him?" "We're preparing a final segment about his supposedly changed views on social programs," the producer replied. "But after this failure, I'm not sure of anything anymore." 30 seconds until airtime," the director announced. Monica adjusted the microphone and tried to compose herself. Things hadn't gone according to plan, but she was a professional. She had one more chance to corner Vance, and she was going to take it. 10-second, 5, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back, Monica Castillo said, trying to regain control of the situation. We continue our frank conversation with Vice President James David Vance. The studio was still buzzing from Vance's emotional response to a question about his wife. Monica noticed that several viewers were filming the proceedings on their phones, despite a strict ban. The interview was already going beyond the usual broadcast. Mr. Vice President, let's move on to the final part of our conversation. Monica straightened up decisively. Many have noted that your political views have undergone a surprising transformation in recent years. Critics talk about political expediency and opportunism. How do you comment on this? Vance smiled slightly, as if he had been expecting this question. You know, Monica, there is a fundamental difference between changing your views and evolving them. If a person at 50 thinks exactly the same way as he did at 20, it is not a sign of integrity. It is a sign that he has stopped learning and growing. But your critics point to radical changes in positions on key issues, Monica insisted. For example, on the role of government in the economy or foreign policy? Let me get this straight, Vance interrupted, now in full control of the conversation. My fundamental principles have never changed. I have always believed in the opportunity for every American, no matter the circumstances of their birth, to achieve their own version of the American dream. I have always believed in a strong, independent America that protects its interests in the world. I have always believed in the value of hard work, family, and community. He paused. What has changed is my understanding of which policy instruments best serve these principles in a changing world. And I am not ashamed of this evolution. I am proud of it. Monica decided to go on the offensive. A concrete example. In your book, you criticize the Washington elite and coastal megacities that are out of touch with the problems of ordinary Americans. Now you are part of this elite. How does this fit together? That's an interesting question, Vance nodded. Let me ask you this in return. If a working-class person gets an education, becomes successful, and reaches a leadership position, does that automatically make them elite? Or is the idea that only a certain type of person can represent the working class problematic? He leaned forward. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. My grandmother still lives in the same house. I go back there every month. I know the price of a gallon of milk and the rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in my hometown. I remember the names of all my high school teachers. And when I make decisions in Washington, I don't think about abstract statistics. I think about the real people I grew up with. Silence fell over the studio. Monica realized that every attempt she made to corner Vance was backfiring on her. And yet, she continued, many people believe that politicians inevitably lose touch with reality when they get to Washington. How can you claim to have escaped that fate? Vance thought for a moment. You know what's wrong with that narrative, Monica? It assumes that there's only one kind of reality in America, that the experience of someone from a small town in Ohio is somehow more real than the experience of someone from Brooklyn or Miami. It's a false dichotomy that divides us instead of uniting us. He met the camera's eyes. The truth is that America is not one reality, but many intertwined realities. And the leader's job is to understand them all and find policies that work for all Americans, not just one group. That sounds good in theory, Monica countered. But in practice, people see that the gap between rich and poor is growing, that the middle class is shrinking, and that's why, Vance interrupted, his voice taking on a new intensity, our administration has passed the most sweeping tax reform ever to help the middle class. That's why we're investing in infrastructure, creating jobs, bringing manufacturing back to America. That's why we're lowering the cost of healthcare, education, and housing. He raised his voice. And you know what's most ironic? The very elites I criticized in my book, the ones who ignored the problems of the middle class for decades, are now criticizing these reforms as populism or economic nationalism. They are afraid of change because the system has worked for them. But my job is not to appease the elite. My job is to represent all Americans, especially those whose voices have been ignored for too long. The audience burst into spontaneous applause. Monica could see the producer behind the camera gesturing wildly, indicating that the ratings had skyrocketed, but that control of the interview had been completely lost. Mr. Vice President, she tried to seize the initiative. Let's return to the issue of the media. You often criticize the mainstream media for bias and manipulation. Don't you think that such rhetoric undermines trust in journalism, which is one of the pillars of democracy? Vance looked at her carefully, as if assessing the sincerity of the question. You know, Monica, I believe in a free press. I believe that journalism is a noble and necessary profession. But I also believe that any institution, including the media, should be open to criticism and self-examination. He paused. The problem is not that journalists ask difficult questions or present different points of view. The problem is that too often the media become not neutral observers, but active participants in the political game. They choose sides, shape narratives, decide which stories are worth listening to and which are not. But doesn't any editorial work involve choosing what to talk about? Monica objected. Of course, Vance agreed. But there is a difference between a choice based on journalistic standards, significance, relevance, public interest, and a choice based on ideological preferences or ratings. He pointed to the screens behind Monica, where the diagrams of his wife's connections to Indian businessmen were still displayed. Look at this. You spent significant resources creating complex graphics that suggested conspiracy and corruption based on unverified claims and manipulative connections. You called it investigative journalism. But when those claims turned out to be false, you simply moved on to the next accusation without admitting error or apologizing. He leaned forward. This is not journalism, Monica. This is entertainment disguised as news. And it is this behavior that undermines public trust in the media, not my criticism. The studio became so quiet you could hear the air conditioners running. Monica felt her palms sweating. Vance wasn't just answering questions. He was turning the entire interview against her, turning her into the target of criticism. With respect, Mr. Vice President, but we are simply asking questions that concern Americans. She tried to defend herself. Really? Vance raised an eyebrow. Then let me ask you a counter question. When was the last time you reported on the drop in insulin prices we got last year? Or the student loan forgiveness program for teachers and nurses? Or the record drop in child poverty? He didn't wait for an answer. These stories directly affect the lives of millions of Americans, but they rarely make it to the airwaves. Instead, we see endless discussions about political drama, scandals, leaks, and rumors. Because it attracts viewers, increases ratings, and brings in advertising dollars. Monica noticed some of the studio audience nodding in agreement. This was unprecedented. Usually the audience was carefully selected based on the show's political leanings. Are you suggesting that the media should not cover political disagreements and disputes? She asked, trying to find a weak point in his argument. I propose balance, Vance replied. I propose context. I propose separating fact from opinion and clearly labeling the difference. I propose remembering that journalism is not just a business, it is a public service. He glanced around the studio. You know what's interesting? Most of the journalists I've met came into the profession with noble intentions. To tell the truth, hold power accountable, serve society. But the system they work in, the system of ratings, clicks, sensations, often forces them to deviate from these ideals. Monica felt a strange silence fall over the studio. Vance was talking about her profession, her world, and most disturbingly, much of what he said resonated with her own doubts and frustrations. And how do you see the solution to this problem? She asked, almost forgetting her original plan to corner him. I believe in self-regulation, Vance replied. I believe the media can and should reform itself from within. More transparency, a clearer distinction between news and opinion, a greater diversity of voices and perspectives, and perhaps most important, a deeper understanding that what most Americans want from their news is not confirmation of their biases, but honest information that will help them make informed decisions. He looked straight into the camera. I'm not just talking to you, Monica, but to the entire media industry. We can do better. We must do better. Because democracy cannot function without an informed electorate, and the electorate cannot be informed without reliable, honest news. The audience applauded again. Monica noticed some of the journalists in the room exchanging glances. She felt like the interview had gotten completely out of her control, but strangely, it no longer felt like a disaster. Something more important was happening here. Some significant moment that went beyond the usual political interview. Mr. Vice President, she said, deciding to ask another question, isn't there a fundamental disconnect between the coastal elite and the heartland of America? Wasn't that the central theme of your book? Vance thought for a moment. There is a divide, but not where many see it. It is not a geographic divide between the coasts and the interior. It is not a political divide between red states and blue states. It is a divide between those who make decisions and those who live with the consequences of those decisions. He paused. When a factory closes in a small town, company executives in New York see only improving quarterly numbers. They don't see empty schools, broken families, rising drug addiction and despair. When a trade deal is signed in Washington, economists see rising GDP and falling prices for consumer goods. They don't see communities losing their economic core and their identity. His voice became more passionate. And you know what the real tragedy is? It's not malice. It's not a conspiracy. It's just a lack of communication, a lack of understanding, a lack of experience. The people making the decisions live in different realities than those who experience the consequences. And how do you propose to bridge this gap? Asked Monica, now truly interested. We start by acknowledging its existence, Vance replied. We acknowledge that no one group has a monopoly on truth or wisdom, that the expertise of a West Virginia miner is as valuable as that of a Harvard professor, that we must listen, really listen, to voices from all over the country. He leaned forward. And then let's build institutions that unite, not divide. Media that seeks shared values, not fuels conflict. Education that teaches critical thinking, not ideology. Politics that focuses on solving problems, not winning the next election. Vance turned to the audience. You know, my grandmother, who raised me, used to say, JD, always remember that every person has a story, and every story deserves respect. She didn't have a college education, but she had wisdom that no university can give. And I try to live by that principle every day. There was silence in the studio. Monica realized that the interview was coming to an end, but she felt she had to ask one more question, a question that now seemed more important than all the gotchas she had prepared. Last question, Mr. Vice President. What would you like Americans to know about you? Not as a politician, but as a person? Vance smiled as if surprised by the sincerity of the question. I want them to know that I'm not perfect, that I've made mistakes and will make mistakes again, that I don't always have the right answers, but I always seek them with pure intentions. He paused. I want them to know that behind all the political labels and agendas is a simple belief. The belief that every American deserves a chance at a decent life, that every child deserves the opportunity to pursue their dreams, that every community deserves to be heard and respected. His voice became quieter, more intimate. And most of all, I want them to know that despite all the divisions and differences we see today, I still believe in America. Not the idealized version of the America of the past, but the America we can still build together. An America that lives up to its highest ideals. An America that holds true to the promise written in our Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights. Vance met the camera's eyes. I believe we can be that America. I believe we should be that America. And every day in this job, I try to bring us closer to that ideal, even if the path is not always straight and not always easy. The studio erupted in applause. The audience stood up. Monica saw tears on some of their faces. Even the stern cameraman holding the camera on Vance was furtively wiping his eyes. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, she said when the applause died down. This has been an unusual conversation. Thank you, Monica, Vance nodded. And if you'll allow me to say one more thing, he turned to the audience, to the cameras, and his voice was filled with a special power. I grew up in a community where people didn't always agree with each other, where there were different opinions, different values, different ways of life. But there was one thing my grandmother taught me to value above all else: respect for every person, regardless of whether I agreed with them or not. Vance paused, looking around the studio. In our modern world, where social media and cable news encourage us to see our opponents as enemies, where compromise is seen as weakness and bitterness as a virtue, we have lost something important. We have lost the ability to see the humanity in those with whom we disagree, the ability to listen rather than simply wait for your turn to speak, the ability to seek common ground, not just differences. His voice became stronger. I am not calling for false unity or the suppression of differences. Healthy debate and honest disagreement are the foundation of democracy. But I am calling for respect, for civil dialogue, for the recognition that behind every political position, there are real people with real concerns, hopes, and fears. Vance stood up, which was unexpected for the interview format, but no one, not even the director, tried to stop him. I believe that most Americans want the same things: decent jobs, safe communities, a good education for their children, affordable health care, clean air and water, and respect for their rights and freedoms. We can and will argue about how best to achieve these goals. But let us never forget that we are on the same side in the most important fight of all: the fight for a better America for everyone. The audience rose as one. The applause was deafening. Monica sat there stunned by the power of the moment she had helped create, though not in the way she had planned. And that concludes our program today, she said when the applause finally died down. We thank Vice President J.D. Vance for this candid conversation When the cameras turned off, the studio was still buzzing with excitement. Spectators surrounded Vance, trying to shake his hand, take selfies, say a few words. Monica sat in her chair, watching with an emotion she couldn't quite place. Was this a failure? A triumph? Something else entirely? Friedman walked up to her, his face a strange combination of delight and confusion. Ratings are going crazy. Social media is blowing up. All the major networks are already asking permission to use clips. What the heck just happened? Monica slowly removed the microphone. I think we just became a part of something important. She looked at Vance, who was exchanging words with an older woman in the audience, holding her hands in his, completely focused on the conversation, as if she were the only person in the room. You know, Alec, Monica said quietly, I came here to expose a politician. But maybe I met a leader instead. Friedman snorted. Don't say that. It's just a well-rehearsed performance. Perhaps, Monica nodded. Or perhaps we're all too accustomed to cynicism to recognize sincerity when we encounter it. She watched as Vance continued to interact with people, paying attention to everyone, regardless of age or appearance. In that moment, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. Disappointment at the failed plan, professional admiration for Vance's skill, and most surprisingly, a glimmer of hope. Maybe, she thought, watching the scene, somewhere between the prepared phrases and the political maneuvering, they had actually caught a glimpse of something real. Something that could change not just one television interview, but the way Americans talk to each other about the issues that matter most. Vance ended his conversation with the older woman and turned, meeting Monica's eyes from across the studio. He gave her a small nod, not triumphant or gloating, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had happened between them. And to her surprise, she found herself nodding back.